Chapter 1. After years of hard work, my company finally went public. The stock options that had been promised to me were now worth $100 million. Looking back on how I had neglected my family for the sake of work, I made a decision. I was going to resign. I envisioned living off the dividends, traveling with my husband, and simply enjoying life. The thought of my frugal husband's joyful reaction upon hearing the news filled my heart with warmth. Smiling, I dialed his number. It took him a while to pick up. "Hey, what's up, honey? I'm out buying groceries. Anything special you want?" "Hey!" He immediately noticed something was off and his tone softened. "What's wrong? Did something happen at work?" I pretended to choke up. "Honey, they fired me." There was a brief silence on the other end. "That can't be. You're one of the company's key people. How could they just fire you?" I sighed heavily. "There's nothing I can do. They turned against me. Afraid I'd get too full of myself, they decided to let me go." A long pause followed. "Maybe we should bring over some gifts and ask your boss to reconsider. The job market is tough right now." I pouted. "They were the ones being unfair. Do you really want me to go back and let them humiliate me? Well, I'll stay home with you for a while, and you'll just have to take care of me," he said, his voice tinged with restrained frustration. "I only make a little over $20,000 a month. How could I possibly support you? You should think of a way to apologize to your boss and ask to come back to work." I hadn't expected his first reaction to be asking me to apologize, especially after everything that had happened. I was about to argue, but Dalton interrupted me. "Honey, I'm busy right now. Just think it over. Jobs are hard to come by these days. Goodbye." Dalton's sudden change in attitude left me stunned. Since we got married, he had always been so accommodating, so eager to please. Now, he wasn't even considering my feelings and instead was asking me to apologize. After our marriage, I was so caught up in work that I couldn't pay attention to the family. But he never minded. He actually felt sorry for how hard I worked. Because of that kindness, despite his humble beginnings, my parents' objections, and the fact that he didn't earn as much as I did, I married him without hesitation. He had the soul of a poet, and his greatest dream was to open a flower shop. So, I rented a shop for him in the city center and even helped him attract clients. In the years we've been together, he didn't rely entirely on me, but without my support, he wouldn't have been able to live such a comfortable, carefree life. But now, when I wanted to take some time off and relax at home, he wanted me to apologize. $20,000 a month might be the total income of some families for the whole year. How could he claim that he couldn't support me? Then, I considered my own situation. My job had always been high-paying, and with my stock options, earning tens of millions a year wasn't far-fetched. The sudden change in circumstances must have been a shock to him. I could understand why he was struggling to process it. After thinking it through, I decided to forgive him this time. Chapter 2. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard Mrs. Wells's voice coming from the living room. "Oh, look who's back, our money-making Marine." I walked in and saw Mrs. Wells cuddling Rena's child affectionately. Dalton was nowhere to be found. The floor was covered with fruit peels and wrappers. She had plopped down on the sofa cross-legged, not even bothering to change her shoes. When she saw me, she raised an eyebrow, her usual sarcastic tone evident. "It's a rare visit from Marine, and not even a smile from you?" I ignored her, but she didn't stop. "Other women don't just offer smiles. When their mother visits, they serve tea, do laundry, and cook. You used to make money, and Dalton didn't want to disturb your work. Now that you're unemployed, you should be fulfilling your role in the family." The argument I had with Dalton earlier over the phone flashed in my mind. I couldn't believe he had shared the news with his family so quickly. When we got married, Mrs. Wells had tried to control me. She demanded all of Dalton's salary and even insisted I hand over my salary card. Naturally, I refused, and it escalated into a fight. She thought I was easily manipulated and even told me, "If you don't hand over your salary, don't expect to marry my son." Dalton had quickly intervened, and after learning how I was treated, he had scolded his mother harshly. To make it up to me and avoid upsetting me, Dalton promised that I wouldn't have to visit their hometown for the holidays. But now, the moment they found out I was unemployed, they couldn't wait to show up at my door. "Are you deaf? Don't you hear me talking?" Mrs. Wells kept shouting, and I felt my anger rise. I threw their luggage outside. "I don't want to see you. Leave now." Seeing my reaction, Mrs. Wells sat on the floor, wailing dramatically. "Heavens, just look at the woman my ungrateful son has married. In the dead of winter, she's throwing her mother out like this. Abusing the elderly? You'll be struck by lightning for this." Rena walked out of the bedroom, her dark complexion smeared with my Yves Saint Laurent lipstick. She walked over, her eyes practically undressing me as she stared at my designer coat. "Maureen, I'm not saying this to be mean, but my mom has worked so hard all her life. Have you ever tried to understand how hard it's been for her? And now, the whole family depends on Dalton. You should be treating her better." As she spoke, she draped my silk robe over herself and plopped down on the sofa. "Which woman doesn't visit her in-laws during the holidays? Maureen, I advise you to treat our family with more respect, or Dalton will kick you out. No amount of begging will make a difference." Her husband, who was sitting nearby smoking, chimed in. "Yeah, Maureen, we're just staying here for a little while. Mom missed Dalton, so we came to see him. And to take care of you too." Looking at this entire family turning everything upside down in my own house, I was speechless. Dalton's house? Ridiculous. I was the one who paid for it. Not to mention how much I had helped Rena's family. Although my relationship with Mrs. Wells was strained, I did feel sympathy for Rena. Mrs. Wells had always favored sons over daughters, refusing to let Rena continue her education and rushing her into marriage for a dowry. She married a lazy, good-for-nothing man. Dalton often felt sorry for her but was helpless to do much. I felt for her situation, so I found her husband a job and even paid for their new house. When Rena cried, saying she wanted a better future for her child, I immediately arranged for the child to attend the best bilingual kindergarten in the city. I had helped them in every way I could. But now that they knew I was unemployed, they immediately turned against me and began bossing me around. Seeing they wouldn't leave, I swallowed my anger, planning to wait until Dalton came home to talk to him. But as soon as I walked into the bedroom, all my accumulated frustration exploded. Chapter 3. The bedroom was a complete disaster, with clothes from the closet strewn across the floor. My jewelry box had been ransacked, some necklaces broken and carelessly tossed aside. The bedspread and sheets had been replaced with a garish red rose patterned set. My niece, Lynn, was sitting on the bed, playing on my tablet and eating spicy snacks, with crumbs scattered all over the bed. I stood there speechless, then found myself laughing at the absurdity of it all. When I cashed in my stock options, I had actually considered buying a store for Rena's family, something to give them a sense of security. I had even thought about buying another house in the city and inviting them to come live with us. But now, I didn't want to do any of that anymore. I grabbed Lynn and pulled her out of the bedroom, heading to the living room. "Let's set a few things straight. This house was bought with my own money. Who gave you permission to touch my things?" Mrs. Wells scoffed. "Hey you're the one who doesn't get it. You married my son, so everything you have belongs to him now. And now that you're unemployed, you still have the audacity to act like you're in charge. When I tell my son to divorce you, we'll see how you handle it. Apologize to me and Rena, then clean up the mess and cook us something. We've been hungry all morning." I was so furious that the room started spinning. "I paid for this house. What does it have to do with Dalton? I'm not asking you to pay for the damages out of respect for him. Don't push it." I quickly dialed Dalton's number. Let's see what Dalton has to say about this. But contrary to what I expected, he didn't answer my call. For the first time ever, Dalton ignored me. I tried again and again, until finally, he picked up. His voice, irritated, came through the phone. "What is it now?" I forced myself to stay composed and said, Get home. Now. Then I hung up. It wasn't until the afternoon that Dalton finally arrived, his lips swollen. Seeing the tense standoff between me and his family, a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Maureen, the flower shop just got a huge order. I've been running around all day. What's going on? Chapter 4. I was about to speak when Mrs. Wells suddenly threw herself into Dalton's arms, crying and complaining. Dalton, you need to do something about your wife. I only said a few things to her, and now she wants to kick me and your sister out. Dalton looked up at her impatiently, briefly offering some words of comfort, then stormed over to me. He scolded me sharply. Maureen, it's not easy for Mom to come all this way. Instead of being respectful and showing her some kindness, you want to throw her out. Is this how a daughter-in-law behaves? Apologize to Mom, and let's move past this. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Was this really the same Dalton who used to care for me so much? How had he changed so drastically? Tears welled up in my eyes, and I choked out. Dalton, you didn't used to say things like this. Dalton's gaze was filled with irritation. Enough. That was then, this is now. You need to understand, you're unemployed now. In this economy, finding a job that pays the same as before is nearly impossible. The real estate market is crashing and all your investments are tied up. Now, the only thing keeping us afloat is my flower shop. Get a grip on reality, or you'll end up with nothing if we divorce. I let out a cold laugh. Was I the one who decided to buy all that property? A few years ago, Dalton had listened to his friends and invested heavily in real estate. He thought it was a foolproof plan, but the market collapsed, leaving most of the projects abandoned and unfinished. Not to mention the stocks he invested in, those all tanked as well. He lost everything. When I found out, the money was already gone. I had wanted to divorce him back then, but he begged me on his knees, asking for forgiveness. He cried, saying that, as a man, he felt insecure and wanted to make more money to feel better about himself. His words softened my heart, and I chose to forgive him. I felt sorry for him, and I didn't hold it against him, thinking that money wasn't everything, that people were more important. But now, it seemed like those past mistakes were being used as ammunition against me. Dalton's two-faced behavior was too much for me to take. But right now, my top priority was getting these irrelevant people out of my house. Dalton, what you think doesn't matter. Just get them out. Or don't blame me for being ruthless. Dalton dropped all pretense. Huh, what leverage do you think you have now? You really think you're still that big-shot CEO, earning millions a year? You still think you can boss me around? Let me tell you, things are different now. Serve me and my mom well, and maybe I'll let you stay. Otherwise, get out. I was so angry that I almost called the police. Just then, Lynn suddenly lunged at me, headbutting me and knocking me to the floor. You're bullying my mom and grandma. You're a bad woman. I don't want you as my aunt anymore. Why is she my aunt and not Helena? As I slowly got up, I caught the key words. Helena? Lynn rolled her eyes at me. Helena is gentle, beautiful, and treats Uncle Dalton so well. You're nothing compared to her. Chapter 5. Lynn continued to criticize me relentlessly. Rena finally told her to stop. Maureen, don't take it to heart. Kids don't always mean what they say. Mrs. Wells sneered. Let her talk. If she understood that there's always someone better, she wouldn't be so arrogant. Now that we're depending on my son, she should be more understanding and just let some things slide. Dalton's eyes flashed with a brief moment of tension before he calmed down. I fixed my gaze on Dalton. Dalton, who is Helena? Dalton's eyes darted away, his expression evasive. Seeing his reaction, my heart sank. I see. A new lover. I said, my voice steady. Dalton quickly denied it. No, don't be ridiculous. We're just friends. Mrs. Wells stepped in front of Dalton, as if shielding him. Son, what are you afraid of? She's unemployed now. It's time for you to step up as the head of the family. Helena is polite and virtuous, 100 times better than this woman. If it weren't for her, Helena would already be my daughter-in-law." She then pulled out her phone and dialed Helena. "Helena, come over. Auntie misses you. Don't worry about that shrew. Just come over now." What more did I need to understand? Dalton had already betrayed me, betrayed our marriage. It was absurd. Dalton's family had turned their lives around because of me. I never imagined Dalton would be fooling around with another woman. Thinking about how I had been working late hours to earn bonuses while he lived in comfort and had an affair made me feel dizzy. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it all started, but seeing how his entire family was in the loop, it had been going on for a long time. From what Mrs. Wells had said. If it weren't for her. It was clear this had started long before Dalton and I got together. I thought back to when we first started dating. Dalton had been so innocent, claiming that I was his first girlfriend. I couldn't help but laugh coldly. What a performance. I had trusted them too much, which had made them feel entitled to everything. When I voiced my suspicions to Dalton, he had smiled and said, "It's my first relationship. I wanted you to have everything other people had, so I read a lot of romance novels." I had been so moved by his words at the time, but now it just felt like a cruel joke. I had unknowingly been wearing the cuckold's hat for far too long. Knowing this now, I felt strangely calm. After all, whether I was unemployed or not, only I knew the truth. Let's see what other tricks this family has up their sleeves. Chapter 6. Half an hour later, a modestly dressed, innocent-looking girl was welcomed in by Mrs. Wells. She glanced at me quickly, then lowered her head shyly. I almost dropped my eyes. Wasn't this the girl who came to toast with red eyes at our wedding back in my hometown? Dalton was very impatient then. When I asked, he said it was a childhood engagement. But he didn't like her and was tired of her pestering. I didn't expect they had been secretly seeing each other. Looking at her, she didn't seem like someone willing to be a mistress. Appearances can be deceiving. As soon as she entered, she hid behind Dalton. "Dalton, I'm scared." Dalton hugged her. "Lilith, don't be afraid. Say hello to your Marine." She timidly said, "Marine." I rolled my eyes. She immediately fell silent, tugging Dalton's shirt. "Dalton, why did Auntie suddenly call me here? Marine is still here." Wow, such an innocent act, not like a mistress at all. So much tea. I raised an eyebrow, saying nothing. My mocking gaze made her shrink back into Dalton's arms. Dalton frowned. "Marine, what's with your attitude? Look how scared Lilith is. Apologize." I snorted. I've never seen a wife apologize to a mistress. This is eye-opening. "Dalton, get a grip. Have I said a word since she walked in? She's stealing my husband. It's a miracle I haven't hit her, and you want me to apologize." Dalton was momentarily speechless. Lilith choked out. "I'm not a mistress. Dalton and I were engaged." Mrs. Wells couldn't hold back. "Marine, know your place. Lilith knew Dalton long before you. If you hadn't broken them up, they would be so happy now." I stared at Dalton. "Is that true, Dalton?" Dalton was flustered. "None of that matters now, Marine. You're living off me now. Be sensible." Dalton looked at Lilith, his voice gentle. "Lilith is devoted to me." Lilith held Dalton's hand. "Don't worry, Dalton. I'll be a good wife and help you." She then skillfully went to the utility room to start cleaning. She was so familiar with the place, she must have been here many times. Thinking about how Dalton and her fooled around in my house while I worked hard made me sick. I wanted to call a cleaning service to disinfect the entire place. Dalton glanced at me disdainfully. "Lilith, stop for a moment." Lilith stopped immediately, wiped her hands and walked over. "Dalton, what is it?" Dalton hugged her. Would you be willing to share me with your Marine and be the second wife? Lilith's eyes darted around, hesitating. After a moment, she firmly said, I would, Dalton. I just want to be with you. No matter what. She then said to me, Sister Marine, let's get along and not make things difficult for Dalton. Mrs. Wells's sharp voice chimed in. Lilith, don't worry about her feelings. Let her sleep in the maid's room tonight. She needs to understand her place. Ha! I couldn't help but laugh. This family's outrageous demands were eye-opening. Did Dalton think he could turn the tables and lord over me because he thought I was unemployed? Dream on. I slowly got up and walked to Dalton. Dalton was momentarily scared, then mustered the courage to say loudly, What? Realizing your mistake and want to apologize? If you kneel and show sincerity, I might. Before he could finish, I slapped him hard. I used all my strength. My hand hurt. Dalton, choosing you was my mistake. Now, thinking about being with you makes me sick. Mrs. Wells saw me hit her precious son and rushed over to hit me. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slammed it down in front of her. Touch me and see what happens. Rena was scared. Marine, calm down. We can talk this out. We're family. Now we rely on Dalton. Be reasonable. What wife hits her husband? I glared at her. You're so virtuous. Remember when you caught your husband cheating and wanted to die with him? She was speechless. Dalton's face turned red and he blustered. Marine, you're too full of yourself. I've tried to reason with you. Let's divorce. See how you do without me. See how well you live as an unemployed woman. I laughed coldly and waited for him to say those words. I immediately packed my belongings, leaving behind anything they had touched. Dalton, our relationship ends here. From now on, we are strangers. Chapter 7. After leaving, I checked into a 5-star luxury hotel. The divorce paperwork was already in process, and once the cooling-off period ended, I would get the certificate. My sole focus now was to finalize the divorce with Dalton. I had a friend connect me with a reputable lawyer. We quickly drafted the divorce agreement. I sent it to Dalton. Soon Dalton called, his voice filled with dissatisfaction. Marine, after all we've been through, you're really going to leave me with nothing? And the flower shop, it's mine. Why should I give it back to you? I replied calmly. Because you betrayed our marriage. Dalton was clearly agitated. Didn't I tell you? Lilith and I knew each other first. You're the intruder. I won't sign this divorce agreement. I laughed. You don't agree? Don't forget who brought in the customers for your flower shop. Do you think you could have opened it in such a prime location without me? The implication was clear. If he didn't give it to me, I would ruin it. Dalton's tone softened immediately. Honey, my tone was wrong. We've been married for so long. Let's discuss this calmly, okay? You know how much I love the flower shop. It's a symbol of our love. And where will we live if you take the house? We've lived there for so long, it feels like home. In the past, his words would have softened my heart, but now they only disgusted me. Dalton, nothing you say will change my mind. And we're already divorced. Call me Marine. Dalton tried to be stubborn. No, honey, you'll always be my wife. He used his usual tactics to try to soften me. Honey, the divorce was just something I said in anger. Let's not go through with it. He was trying to play the long game. I played along. Then support me, like I supported you. Before he could respond, I hung up. I paid for the house, and the flower shop was my investment. Dalton had the nerve to claim them. Shamelessness must run in the family. I didn't care about the money. My monthly dividends from the stock options were more than enough. I just didn't want them to benefit. I thought of many ways to deal with them, knowing Dalton's gambler mentality. I decided to leave the flower shop to them. The shop thrived in the prime CBD location because of the long-term clients I had established. The next day, when Dalton asked to meet, I agreed immediately. But I insisted they move out of my downtown apartment first. Chapter 8. To keep the profitable flower shop, Dalton hurriedly moved out of the apartment. I brought a security team to supervise, ensuring they didn't take anything valuable. Mrs. Wells sat at the door, wailing, "Someone come and see this ungrateful daughter-in-law." Her loud cries attracted the neighbors, who gathered in the emergency stairwell to watch. The more people there were, the more dramatic she became. Maureen, as soon as she married my son, she turned him against me. Now, she wants a divorce and is kicking us out. She relied on my son's earnings, and now she wants him to leave with nothing. I stood by, coldly watching and scrolling through my phone. When she seemed tired, I added fuel to the fire. "Keep going. Why stop? Call everyone over to see how your son cheated during our marriage and demanded to wives." I quickly pulled the hiding Lilith out. "Look, the mistress is right here. One to earn money, one to serve him at home." Dalton's plan was quite something. The neighbors, sharp as ever, quickly understood. They exchanged glances and collectively looked down on Dalton and his family. Shameless. How can someone be so brazen? Everyone knows Maureen is a company executive, holding the family together. Now they're turning the tables, saying she relied on him. And he has a mistress. Can't even properly latch onto a rich woman. This is a first. Mrs. Wells is a leech too. How much has she taken from Maureen? Their comments made Dalton's family turn red with embarrassment. Mrs. Wells stopped crying, quickly stood up, and packed her things. Lilith bit her lip, stubbornly saying, "I knew Dalton first. I'm not a mistress. Say what you want about me, but leave Dalton out of it." The neighbors sneered. "Do you know what marriage is? If you knew him first, why didn't you get married? You seduced a married man. You're a mistress. Own up to it. You've done shameless things and want a good reputation. What a joke." Another neighbor looked her up and down. "You seem like a decent girl. How could you do something so disgraceful? Your parents must be so ashamed." They didn't forget to give Dalton a disdainful look. Dalton, furious, pulled Lilith. "Hurry up! Can't you see Mom is struggling? Stop talking nonsense. Aren't you embarrassed?" Lilith's eyes reddened. "I just wanted to clear your name." Chapter 9. Watching their performance, I was fed up. Impatiently, I urged, "How much longer? It's been half a day." Hearing this, Mrs. Wells and Rena slowed down, deliberately trying to annoy me. Seeing this, I didn't bother arguing. I gave a signal, and the security team understood, entering the house and throwing out Mrs. Wells's luggage. She screamed, "What are you doing?" The security team said nothing. Seeing the strong men, they didn't dare speak up. I looked at them coldly. "Get out if you don't want to get hurt." They had no choice but to leave, cursing under their breath. After they left, I called a cleaning service to thoroughly clean the place and contacted a real estate agent to list it for sale. That evening, I saw Dalton's family had moved into a new apartment on social media. Lilith had cooked a meal and Mrs. Wells commented, "A good daughter-in-law makes all the difference." Her words implied I was the bad one. I kept Dalton's contact and deleted the rest. Given Dalton's personality, they must have taken on high-interest debt, thinking the flower shop would quickly pay it off. I waited for the show to unfold. When the cooling-off period ended, Dalton still tried to talk me out of the divorce. "Maureen, if you were obedient, we could have had a good life. With your looks and talent, you were lucky to marry me. If you couldn't earn money, I wouldn't have married you. Don't be so aggressive with your next husband." I laughed coldly. "Men like you, who live off women, even if there were 10 of you, I wouldn't want any. At least a farmer or butcher works for a living. They're better than you." "You!" Dalton, furious, grabbed the divorce certificate and left, warning me, Don't come crying to me." I laughed, waiting for their downfall. After the divorce, I took my savings and the newly arrived $1 million dividend to the city of Zishawangbana and enjoyed a few months of leisure. When I returned, I bought a new villa. Some former subordinates and clients visited, and we talked about Dalton. They knew we had divorced, and the flower shop's orders dwindled, unable to cover the high rent. Dalton borrowed heavily, contacting clients one by one. But all he heard was, "We only supported you because you were Maureen's husband. Now that you're divorced, why should we buy your flowers? The quality isn't even as good as roadside stalls." Soon, Dalton's flower shop went bankrupt, forcing him and Lilith to work to pay off debts. Seeing Dalton's debt, Lilith stopped pretending and left him for a wealthy man. Unable to accept it, Dalton tried to reconcile with me, but I had blocked him after the divorce. In a fit of rage, he killed Lilith and was sentenced to life in prison. His mother and sister, hounded by debt collectors, sold everything but still couldn't pay off the debts. They ended up begging on the streets. Hearing their fate, I smiled faintly. They brought it upon themselves. They couldn't appreciate a good life and made poor choices. As for me, after leaving Dalton, I had a much better life ahead.